If you've ever felt like the people closest to you could become your biggest strangers, then this story is for you. Stay with me today because what I'm about to share is something I've carried for a long time, and I think you need to hear it. If stories like this touch your heart, please consider subscribing because every week I share real moments, real pain, and real turning points. And trust me, you don't want to miss what happens at the end of this one. I still remember the exact sound of my own footsteps as I walked up the driveway that afternoon. It was a Tuesday, ordinary sky, a few clouds, the kind of day that gives you no warning for what's waiting inside. I had left work early because my mother had called me around noon, and her voice, it just didn't sound right. She said she was fine. She said, "Don't worry, Beta, I'm okay." But there was something underneath those words, a tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself she was probably just tired from the journey. She'd arrived at our home only 4 days earlier, her first visit since my wedding almost 2 years before. I pushed open the front door, and I stopped. My mother was standing near the kitchen doorway, one hand pressed flat against the wall to keep herself upright. Her dupatta was crooked. Her face was pale in a way that scared me. She wasn't moving. She was just holding herself there, like she'd been standing so long that sitting down had become a distant memory. And from the living room, from my living room in my house, I could hear laughter. Loud, comfortable, unbothered laughter. My in-laws were seated on the sofa. My father-in-law had his feet up on the coffee table. My mother-in-law was leaning back, picking at a bowl of snacks that sat between them. My wife, Priya, was on the armchair nearest the window, scrolling through her phone, smiling at something on the screen. Nobody looked up when I walked in. Nobody noticed that the woman in the doorway, my mother, a 61-year-old woman who had traveled 8 hours on a bus to visit her son, was barely standing on her own 2 feet. I didn't say a word. Not yet. I walked to my mother first. I took her arm gently and guided her to the nearest chair. Her hand was cold. She looked up at me and immediately tried to smile. That specific smile she's always had, the one that says, "I'm fine, don't make a fuss." But her eyes told a completely different story. "Sit, Amma," I said quietly. "Just sit." And I went to get her water. To understand what happened that day, you have to understand who my mother is. She is not a dramatic woman. She does not ask for things. She does not complain. If you sat with her for a week, she would feed you, clean around you, ask about your health, and never once mention that her knees have been aching for 3 years, or that she skips meals some days because the pension doesn't stretch as far as it used to. She raised me alone. My father passed when I was 9 years old. A sudden thing, a heart attack, gone in a night. And just like that, my mother went from being a homemaker to being everything. She started stitching clothes for the neighborhood women. She took in ironing. On festival seasons, she made pickles and sweets and sold them to families who had more than we did. She never let me feel poor. I didn't understand until I was much older how carefully she had engineered that feeling of normalcy for me. How many times she had quietly gone without so that I could have a new textbook, new shoes, one more year of tuition classes. I used to find her awake at 2 in the morning sometimes, not because she couldn't sleep, but because she was catching up on work after I went to bed so I wouldn't see her struggle. That woman who had given her entire life to make mine livable, was standing against a wall in my house, forgotten, while my in-laws laughed at a television program. I had married Priya 3 years ago. She was charming when we met, educated, well-presented, funny in the early days. Her family was what people would call well-to-do. They had a larger house, a car, social connections. And from the very first meeting, I could feel the slight imbalance they perceived between her background and mine. Nothing was ever said outright. It was in the pauses, the way her father would ask about my job and then glance at his wife with that nearly invisible expression. The way her mother once described my hometown as quaint, small words, careful words, the kind that leave no fingerprints. I told myself it didn't matter. Priya herself seemed different from them, warmer, less concerned with status. But people show you who they are slowly, not all at once. The first year of our marriage was fine, surface level fine, the way new things often are. But somewhere in the second year, I began to notice a pattern. Whenever my mother called, Priya would leave the room. Not rudely, just conveniently. She'd suddenly need water, or the bathroom, or to check on something in the kitchen. My mother's calls were short because she didn't want to impose. But even those short calls seemed to create an invisible tension in the house that no one named but everyone felt. When I suggested bringing my mother to stay with us for a few weeks, Priya had smiled and said, of course, whatever I wanted. But in the days that followed, her mother called 3 times. Her father visited once. And slowly, without any dramatic confrontation, a set of conditions was communicated to me through atmosphere alone, through sighs, through rearranged schedules, through small remarks about space and adjustment. I pushed past it. I made the arrangements. I brought my mother, and for the first 4 days I was at work. I trusted that she would be fine. I trusted that the woman I had married would treat my mother with basic dignity. That was my mistake. When my mother had enough water in her and some color started coming back to her face, I sat beside her and spoke quietly. Amma, what happened? She shook her head, started to say nothing happened. I waited. I've known her long enough to know that silence from her is not emptiness, it's fullness. She was full of something she didn't want to say. I waited, and slowly, the way water finds its way through a crack in stone, the truth came out. My in-laws had arrived 2 days after my mother. They hadn't planned to come, or rather, they hadn't told me they were planning to come. They simply appeared with bags, with preferences, with the comfortable ease of people who have never questioned whether they are welcome. And the moment they arrived, the dynamic of the house shifted. My mother, who had been quietly helping around the house, cooking a little, folding laundry, trying to be useful in the way she always has, suddenly found herself in a different role. Not a guest, not a mother. Something closer to staff. It started with small things. My mother-in-law asking if she could make tea. My mother, being who she is, said yes. Then asking if she could make it a certain way. Then asking if she could clean the stovetop after. Then suggesting with a smile that since my mother clearly enjoyed cooking, she might as well manage the meals while they were visiting so that Priya could spend time with her parents. My mother had said yes, because she always says yes. And then the days rolled on. She cooked 3 meals a day. She washed the dishes. She cleaned the kitchen. She mopped the floor once because my mother-in-law made a casual remark about a streak near the dining table. She washed the guest bathroom. She carried tea to the living room and was thanked the way you thank a waiter. A nod, a murmur, eyes already back on the screen. And she stood. She stood for so many hours in that kitchen that her legs, which were already struggling, had started to give way. She didn't say anything because she didn't want to cause trouble. She didn't want me to come home to conflict. She was protecting me, the way she has always protected me, even when she was the one who needed protection. When I asked why she hadn't called me, she looked at me with those quiet eyes and said, "You were at work." What would I say? I had to look away for a moment. I went back into the living room. My mother-in-law was saying something to Priya about a relative's wedding. My father-in-law was watching a cricket match. Priya looked up when I came in, read something in my face, and looked back down at her phone. Nobody asked about my mother. Nobody said, "Oh, is Auntie feeling okay?" Nobody said anything at all. And I stood there in the entrance of that living room, and I felt something happen inside me that I don't quite have a word for. It wasn't rage. Rage is hot, and this was cold. It was more like a door closing, quietly, firmly. The kind of closing that doesn't make noise because it doesn't need to. I thought about my mother at 2 in the morning with a needle and thread. I thought about the one pair of good sandals she had, the ones she'd worn for 6 years because she kept saying she didn't need new ones. I thought about every time she'd called me from back home and asked, first thing, not how are you, but are you eating? Is Priya happy? Is everything good? Always others first, always herself last. I thought about her standing against that wall, and I made a decision. I didn't announce it. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice or throw accusations into the room. I simply turned around and went to the bedroom, and I called my office and arranged to take the next 3 days off.
Then I called a car service. The next morning I woke up early. I made breakfast myself. properly, the way my mother likes it, the small things she never asks for but appreciates. I sat with her at the kitchen table and we talked, just the two of us in low voices before the house woke up. She held her cup with both hands the way she always does. She seemed lighter somehow now that I was there. When my in-laws came out for breakfast and found the table already set, my mother-in-law made a remark about how she'd been planning to make something special. I smiled and said there was no need. Everything was done. The car I had arranged arrived at 11. I had booked my mother on a flight home, not a bus this time, a flight. The good kind, with a seat that reclines. I had arranged for my cousin to pick her up from the airport on the other end. I had packed her bag myself, folded everything carefully, tucked in a small envelope with money because I knew she wouldn't spend it on herself unless it was already in her hand. When I told her, she protested. She said it was too much. She said she didn't need a flight. She said she was fine. I looked at her and said, "You are not fine, Amma, and you shouldn't have to be fine here. Go home, rest. I will come and see you next month." She cried a little, just briefly. Then she held my face in her hands the way she used to when I was small, and she didn't say anything, and I understood everything she meant. I put her in that car and I stood at the end of the driveway and I watched it until it turned the corner and disappeared. Then I went back inside. My wife was standing in the hallway. "You sent her away?" she said. Her voice had that careful quality, not quite an accusation, but shaped like one. "She was exhausted," I said. "She needed to rest." She didn't say anything to me about leaving. "No," I agreed. "She wouldn't." There was a pause. "My parents are going to wonder. I'd like your parents to leave today," I said. And I said it the same way I'd said everything else that morning, quietly, without performance. Not because I'm angry, but because my home needs to settle, and I have things to work out. Priya stared at me. I don't think she'd heard me speak exactly like that before. Not cold, not cruel, just decided, like something had reorganized itself inside me and this was simply the result. Her parents left that afternoon. My mother-in-law made a comment on her way out about tension in the air and how she hoped things would sort themselves out. My father-in-law shook my hand with the practiced warmth of a man who has never had to examine himself too closely. I smiled at both of them and said nothing that wasn't necessary. After they left, Priya and I sat in the living room for a long time without speaking. Then I said, "I want to talk, properly. Not to fight, not to win anything, but because something happened here that I cannot unsee." And we talked. For hours, maybe. The kind of talking that marriages sometimes desperately need and often avoid because it is painful, and the truth that comes out of it doesn't always leave you comfortable. I told her what my mother had done in those days, how she had stood in the kitchen until she could barely stand, how no one had thanked her, how no one had told her to rest, how she had been treated, not maliciously perhaps, but thoughtlessly, and thoughtlessness has its own kind of cruelty. Priya was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't know it got to that point," and I said, "That's part of the problem." The weeks after that were complicated. Her parents were upset. I heard through relatives, through indirect channels, the way these things always travel. Her mother had apparently told several people that I had thrown them out. Her father had made remarks about my attitude. Some of Priya's cousins reached out to her, I assume with their own versions of events, their own sympathies. And on my side, when I told my aunt what had happened, she was furious, ready to call people, ready to say things. I asked her not to. I didn't want noise, I wanted resolution, or if resolution wasn't possible, then at least clarity. There were people who told me I had overreacted. There were people who said maybe my mother should have spoken up earlier. There were the usual voices that appear in every family situation, the ones who need everything to go back to peaceful even if the peace is built on someone's silence. I listened to all of it. I didn't argue. I had made my position clear where it mattered, and that was enough. My mother called me a week after she got home. She sounded like herself again, the real herself, not the careful, muted version she'd been in those last few days. She had slept properly, She had seen her neighbor, an old friend, and they'd sat on the veranda in the evenings talking. She had gone to the local temple, the small one near the market, and she said there was a breeze that afternoon that reminded her of years ago. She didn't bring up what had happened, not directly, but near the end of the call, she said something I've thought about every day since. She said, "You know what I remembered the other day? When you were maybe 7 or 8 years old, you came home from school one day very quiet. You'd seen some boys teasing another child at the bus stop and you hadn't said anything, and it had bothered you all day. You came home and you told me and you said, 'Amma, I should have said something.' And I told you, it's not always the one who shouts who does the most. Sometimes the one who stays and stays and stays quietly and then does one right thing, that person changes the most." She paused, and then she said, "You did one right thing." Priya and I are still together. I want to be honest about that because real life isn't a clean story with a final verdict. We are working through things. It is slow. There are conversations that are hard and silences that are harder. She has acknowledged in her own way that she allowed something to happen that she shouldn't have. Whether that acknowledgement deepens over time into real change, that I don't yet know. What I do know is that I am no longer willing to buy peace at the price of someone else's dignity, especially not hers, especially not my mother's. There is a particular kind of grief in realizing that the home you built could become the place where the person who made you feel most unsafe. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives slowly in small moments, in averages, gazes, and turned backs and laughter that has no room in it for someone you love. And there is a particular kind of quiet strength in choosing, without drama, without destruction, to say, "No, not like this, not anymore." My mother stood against a wall to keep herself upright because she didn't want to cause a fuss. I decided that afternoon that she would never have to be that quiet again. Not in my house, not anywhere near me. That one decision, that one silent, firm, unhurried decision, changed something in me that I think needed to change. I don't know if I did everything right, but I know I did one right thing, and sometimes that's exactly enough. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something, or think about someone in your own life who deserves more than silence, I'd be grateful if you liked this and subscribed. It means more than you know. I'll see you in the next one.